The kitchen at the Averill Grand Hotel had 5 walk-in coolers, and one of them had never quite finished doing its job. Marcus Whitfield had known this for most of his career, though it had taken him years to understand that knowing it and understanding it were two entirely different things. He was 60 now, chief engineer of a hotel that had been operating continuously since 1958, through 3 ownership changes and 2 full kitchen renovations that had touched nearly every piece of equipment in the building except one. He had learned to care about that particular cooler from a man named Desmond Ovitz, who had held Marcus's job for 24 years before him, and who approached his work with thoroughness that had struck nearly everyone else at the hotel as slightly more than the job required. Marcus started at the Averill Grand at 34, hired as a junior engineer under Ovitz during a period when the hotel was still owned by the family that had built it. Ovitz was in his final decade then, a compact, deliberate man who moved through the kitchen's mechanical spaces with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent half his life listening to machines that most people only ever looked at. A walk-in doesn't fail all at once, Ovitz told him during Marcus's second week, standing in front of the kitchen's bank of refrigeration units with a clipboard tucked under one arm. It tells you for years first, if you're the kind of person who reads a thermometer instead of just trusting it. Ovitz kept handwritten logs, daily readings on every walk-in's internal temperature, taken at the same time each morning. Recorded in a spiral notebook he replaced every 18 months and never once threw away. By the time he retired, he had accumulated a small shelf of them, stretching back further than Marcus had years to appreciate at the time. He left the whole shelf to Marcus, along with a clipboard and a piece of advice that Marcus had carried with him ever since. Numbers don't lie. People do, sometimes without meaning to. Trust the numbers. The Averill Grand's ground floor kitchen had been built in 1958 and had survived 2 major renovations since. One in 1981, one in 2003, each time gaining new equipment, updated electrical service, and modernized workflow layouts, while somehow never quite getting around to replacing every original unit. Cooler 3 was the last one standing from the original 1958 installation. It sat against the kitchen's north wall, comparable in size to its 4 newer neighbors, service on the same maintenance schedule, running a compressor that met the same specifications as the others when it was last replaced in 1996. By every measure anyone could point to, it should have behaved exactly like the rest of the kitchen's refrigeration bank. It didn't. Every walk-in cooler, when its door opens, loses cold air and warms briefly before its compressor cycles back to bring the internal temperature down to its set point. This recovery time is a normal, expected part of how refrigeration works. A few minutes, typically, depending on how long the door was open and how much warm air entered. Cooler 3 took longer. Not dramatically longer. Not longer in a way that would trigger any alarm or fail any inspection, but consistently, measurably, longer than every other walk in the kitchen, every single time its door was opened, for as long as anyone had bothered to track it. Ovitz's earliest surviving log entry noting the pattern specifically was dated 1979, 17 years before Marcus arrived. The notebook page, yellow but legible, read, asterisk, cooler 3 recovery time still running long. Compressor tested within spec. Door seal replaced twice. No change. Something about that unit just holds heat longer than it should. Watching it, asterisk. Marcus had read that entry during his first year with the notebooks, sitting in the small engineering office off the kitchen's loading dock, and felt something click into place that he wouldn't fully articulate to himself for years afterward. Ovitz had noticed something real. Ovitz had never solved it, and Ovitz had kept watching anyway, patient enough to record a mystery he never got to finish. Marcus began logging Cooler 3's recovery times himself, the same way, every month, without ever being asked to, not because anyone required it of him, mostly because Ovitz had asked him to keep the notebooks going, and Ovitz had never once, in 24 years, been sloppy about anything that mattered. The delay never went away. It held steady for years, exactly as Ovitz's earlier entries described, a stubborn few extra seconds at no repair, no compressor swap, no maintenance cycle ever fully resolved. In his 11th year keeping the logs, Marcus noticed something Ovitz's earlier records had never quite had enough data points across enough years to reveal clearly. He had been transcribing that month's recovery time figure into a running column he'd started keeping on the back pages of his current notebook, a habit of precision that went slightly beyond what Ovitz himself had done, since Ovitz had recorded pass/fail observations rather than exact figures. Looking at 11 years of numbers stacked one below another, Marcus noticed the delay wasn't perfectly flat. It wasn't dramatic, but laid out year over year. The recovery time was very gradually lengthening. A few extra seconds most years, sometimes nothing measurable at all, but never shrinking, never reversing. He went back through Ovitz's older notebooks, searching for any recovery time figures specific enough to compare against his own more recent data. Ovitz hadn't recorded exact numbers consistently enough to build a clean historical trend, but his qualitative notes, still running long, no better than last check, consistent with prior years, suggested the same slow, patient worsening had likely been happening since well before Marcus's own logs began. If the trend held even roughly steady across the full span since Ovitz's 1979 entry, not 11 years, but closer to 45, then whatever was causing Cooler 3 to hold heat longer than it should have been getting slowly, quietly worse for nearly half a century, without ever crossing a threshold sharp enough to alarm anyone paying attention only to whether the unit passed its annual service inspection. Marcus sat with that thought for a long time one evening in the engineering office, the same small room where Ovitz used to keep his own logs. He thought about what it would mean if a piece of equipment that had never once failed an inspection had been quietly telling a different story for 45 years, a story nobody had ever had the patience or the data to fully read. He had a theory once, in his 16th year, that the compressor itself might simply be aging out of peak efficiency faster than its rated service life suggested, an internal wear pattern specific to that unit's manufacturing batch, something that wouldn't show up on a standard diagnostic, but would explain a gradual, compounding inefficiency. He spent the better part of summer researching the compressor's manufacturing records, cross-referencing serial numbers against known batch issues from that era, convinced he had finally found the explanation 45 years of watching had never produced. The compressor had been replaced in 1996. It was a different unit entirely from whatever Ovitz had been monitoring in 1979. If the delay predated the 1996 replacement and continued unchanged afterward, the compressor itself couldn't be the root cause. Whatever was happening to the walk-in structure, not its mechanical components. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in his own notebook, in the same unembellished style Ovitz had modeled for him. Asterisk compressor batch theory. Ruled out. Delay predates 1996 replacement unit and continues unchanged afterward. Causes structural, not mechanical. Back to unexplained. Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the compressor to be the answer. It was clean, mechanical, replaceable. The kind of explanation that let you close a question instead of continuing to carry it forward. Being wrong meant admitting the mystery lived somewhere Marcus had no easy tools to examine. Inside the walk-in's floor walls or foundation, places a service technician's diagnostic equipment was never designed to look. The kitchen modernization announcement came in his 23rd year. Hotel ownership, under new management after an acquisition 2 years earlier, approved a full kitchen renovation, new equipment throughout, updated workflow design, and, notably for Marcus, new larger walk-in units replacing all 5 of the kitchen's existing coolers. To manage costs, the project would reuse Cooler 3's existing footprint and utility connections rather than relocating that section of the kitchen entirely. Marcus read the renovation brief carefully. A new unit, built to modern efficiency standards, installed in the exact same footprint Cooler 3 currently occupied. If the cause of the recovery delay lived in the floor beneath that footprint rather than in the equipment itself, a new compressor, however efficient, would be fighting the same underlying problem all over again, just with stronger motor, working harder to compensate for whatever the floor was quietly doing to it. He brought his concern in 45 years of combined logs to the renovation project manager. Her name was Corinne Baptiste, and she managed commercial kitchen renovation projects for a firm the new ownership group used regularly. She was thorough and fair, the kind of project manager who genuinely listened before forming a conclusion, though the conclusion she reached wasn't the one Marcus was hoping for. He laid out everything on the folding table in the half-renovated kitchen, Ovitz's oldest notebooks, his own 11 years of precise recovery time figures, the ruled-out compressor theory, and the slow, unmistakable multi-decade trend the two records suggested together. Corinne reviewed it carefully. She consulted the refrigeration vendor's commissioning engineer, a capable man named Felix Adeyemi, who examined the existing compressor specifications and the utility connections plan for the new installation. Everything's within manufacturer tolerance, Adeyemi said, reviewing his own notes afterward. The new units are considerably more efficient than what's currently installed. Whatever lingering inefficiency has been affecting that walk-in, a modern compressor with better insulation and tighter door seals should simply resolve it. New technology solving an old building's old problem. It was a reasonable sounding position. Marcus didn't have a competing engineering credential to argue against it directly. What he had was 45 years of a delay that had survived a compressor replacement once already, without changing at all. The delay didn't go away when the compressor was replaced in 1996, Marcus said. If it's not the compressor, a better compressor won't fix it. It'll just run harder trying to compensate for something else. What do you think the something else is? Adeyemi asked, not dismissively, genuinely curious, in a way Marcus had learned to recognize from people who took evidence seriously even without yet having an explanation to offer in return. I don't know, Marcus admitted. I've been trying to figure that out for 23 years. I only know it isn't the compressor and it isn't the door seal, because both of those have already been replaced without changing anything. The project proceeded on its original timeline. The committee's position, reasonable given the information available, was that the new equipment's superior specifications will resolve any lingering inefficiency regardless of its ultimate cause. Marcus didn't sleep well through that autumn. He kept circling back to an uncomfortable question that had followed him for years without ever fully resolving. What if Ovitz's original 1979 observation had captured something real that had simply stopped matching by the time anyone thought to look closely, an early manufacturing quirk from the walk-in's original 1958 installation, long since irrelevant? And what Marcus had been chasing for 23 years was a habit of attention rather than an active, worsening problem? He had wanted for years for the slow multi-decade trend to mean something structural, something that would justify the care he'd put into tracking numbers most people would have dismissed as noise after the first few readings. Wanting it to mean something wasn't the same as it meaning something. He had wanted for years for the slow multi-decade trend to mean something structural, something that would justify the care he'd put into tracking numbers most people would have dismissed as noise after the first few readings. Wanting it to mean something wasn't the same as it meaning something. He pulled Ovitz's oldest notebook off the shelf one more night. Sitting alone in the engineering office with the kitchen quiet around him after closing, and reread the 1979 entry slowly. Asterisk something about that unit just holds heat longer than it should. Watching it, asterisk. Ovitz had never claimed to know the cause. He had only insisted the effect was real, worth recording, worth passing on to whoever came next. Marcus had that same effect now, documented across 45 combined years, with precise figures Ovitz's era of simple pass-fail notes had never captured. He didn't have the cause confirmed either, but not having it hadn't stopped Ovitz from writing the first entry, and it wasn't a reason for Marcus to let the record go unexamined now, with a new compressor about to be installed in the exact same footprint that had never fully explained itself. He requested, at his own initiative, a single afternoon with a structural engineer before the new installation began. Not to delay the renovation, he made clear, only to understand the floor beneath Cooler 3 before it disappeared behind a new unit for another quarter century. The engineer's name was Priya Anand, and she specialized in foundation and slab assessments for older commercial buildings. She reviewed the hotel's original 1958 construction drawings alongside Marcus's decades of recovery time data, and she brought ground-penetrating radar equipment to examine the floor slab directly beneath Cooler 3's footprint. She spent a full day on the assessment, running the radar unit in a careful grid across the section of floor, then cross-referencing what she found against the original construction drawings notation for that area of the kitchen. What she found, confirmed with follow-up core sample 2 days later, explained 45 years of a delay nobody had been able to name. During the 1958 construction, a shallow mechanical utility trench had been dug beneath what was now Cooler 3's footprint, carrying an early refrigeration drain line to the building's main way system. Standard practice for the era called for properly compacting the backfill material after the trench was closed, but the original construction record showed a change order, dated late in the project, noting a compressed timeline and authorizing loose fill material rather than the specified compacted soil, a common cost-cutting shortcut when a project ran behind schedule and needed to close out quickly. Over 60-plus years, that loose fill had been slowly settling and shifting with seasonal ground moisture, very gradually altering the thermal contact between the walk-in's floor slab and the soil beneath it. A properly compacted, stable subgrade conducts and dissipates heat predictably. Loose, settling fill does not. It creates uneven pockets of air and moisture that change how efficiently a floor slab's insulation performs, sometimes for the better, more often for the worse. The floor under that cooler has never had a stable thermal relationship with the ground beneath it. Priya explained to Marcus, reviewing her findings afterward. It's been slowly shifting for 6 decades. That's why the recovery delay was there from the start, in your predecessor's earliest notes, and why it's been getting very gradually worse. The settlement never stopped. It's just been happening too slowly for any single year's reading to look alarming. And a new compressor in the same footprint? Marcus asked, would run harder and more often trying to compensate for a floor assembly that isn't performing the way it should. Priya said, it might mask the problem for a while, especially with better equipment, but it wouldn't fix anything. And a harder working unit installed over ground that's still actively settling is asking for accelerated wear, higher energy costs, and eventually a compressor failure that looks sudden but really isn't. Priya's findings went into a formal supplementary report submitted to Corinne Baptiste and the ownership group within the week. Felix Adeyemi reviewed it personally and called Marcus afterward. You were right to push for this, Adeyemi said. A new compressor in that same footprint would have been fighting a losing battle from day one, and probably failed early enough that everyone would have assumed it was a bad unit rather than a bad foundation. The renovation was revised. The section of floor beneath Cooler 3 was properly excavated, the settled fill removed, and the area backfilled correctly with compacted, engineered material for the first time since 1958. The new walk-in insulation proceeded afterward, 6 weeks behind the original schedule and moderately over budget, but built on ground that finally matched what the original specifications had called for. The hotel's engineering department filed a formal completion report, crediting both Desmond Ovitz's original 1979 observation and Marcus's 23 years of continued documentation as the basis for identifying a foundation condition that had never appeared in any prior inspection, service record, or renovation survey. Marcus kept Ovitz's old notebooks. He added a final entry of his own to the most recent volume before finally moving the whole shelf from his own office into the hotel's permanent facilities archive. Asterisk Cooler 3 floor excavated and backfilled this year. Original condition dated to 1958 construction shortcut, documented in formally 1979 to 2023. Recovery time normal for the first time on record. Desmond, you were right, something was wrong. Neither of us knew what for a very long time. Asterisk. He stood in the finished kitchen for a while after the new equipment was installed, watching the new Cooler 3 cycle close after a door test, its recovery time matching its 4 neighbors almost exactly for the first time in the unit's entire operating history. He timed it twice, just to be sure. Both times, the number came back clean. He thought about Ovitz, standing in the same kitchen decades earlier, clipboard under one arm, telling a nervous new hire that numbers don't lie, that a walk-in tells you for years before it fails, if you're the kind of person who reads thermometer instead of just trusting it. Marcus had carried that lesson for 23 years past Ovitz's retirement, through a ruled-out compressor theory, to a season of genuine doubt about whether he'd spent decades chasing something that had simply stopped matching, and through a quiet fear he never said aloud, that he might raise an alarm about a 60-year-old shortcut, be wrong, and be remembered as the engineer who saw problems that weren't there. He hadn't needed to be right immediately. He had only needed to keep reading the thermometer, the way Ovitz had taught him, until the number finally explained itself. Somewhere on a shelf in the hotel's archive now, a row of notebooks sat quietly, spines facing outward, recording nothing more dramatic than ordinary morning temperature checks, stretching back further than most current staff had been alive. Nobody browsing that shelf would think to open them. But if someone eventually did, they would find, in two different hands across nearly half a century, the same plain sentence repeated in different words. Something isn't quite right here, and I don't know why yet, but I'm going to keep watching until I do. That, Marcus had come to understand, was the entire job. Not always having the answer, just refusing to stop noticing, long enough for the building to explain itself to someone patient enough to listen.